With so many sets and individual cards existing in Magic, it's understood that not every card is going to be viable at a competitive level. And while many cards do find homes in Commander or even more casual forms of play, there are several cards in the game that are pretty much useless. Between terrible effects that were never good to cards that just simply do not function with the modern rules of the game, there are more than a few cards that have little to no reason to ever be played at all. Starting us off at number 10, we have Mudhole. This instant costs 2 generic and 1 red mana for an instant that exiles all land cards from target player's graveyard. Generally speaking, while graveyard hate is narrow, it has often seen play in sideboards in most formats. Graveyard strategies are potent in any format, and whenever graveyard decks are prominent in a meta, people are sure to find the best graveyard interactions they can to counter it. One of the biggest points against Mudhole is that it costs colored mana. While typically red does not have much graveyard hate and Mudhole is a somewhat unique effect in the color, red decks do have access to plenty of strong graveyard hate through artifacts. Soul Guide Lantern not only exiles any card of your choice from a graveyard when it enters the battlefield, it can be tapped and sacrificed to exile each opponent's graveyard. Mudhole costs 3 times as much mana and only exiles the land cards from one player's graveyard, whereas a Lantern only costs 1 generic mana and can exile all of your opponent's graveyards. But what makes this card useless beyond being just overcosted and niche is that lands are often the least important cards to exile from a graveyard. Decks that are built around the graveyard tend to focus more on bringing creatures back or casting spells from the graveyard. As such, Mudhole won't really exile any of the more relevant cards one might be worried about when sideboarding in graveyard hate. Some decks do care about lands in the graveyard, and generally speaking, it's better to remove them if you can, but there is no reason to remove specifically land cards from a graveyard when the most generic graveyard removal can hit everything. It's not hard to argue that Mudhole is the strongest card on this list. However, that's no compliment to the card, since the card's only real claim to fame is being graveyard hate in a color that doesn't really get it naturally. Even when compared to cards from 14 years ago, like Relic of Progenitus, there was never really a time where Mudhole was close to playable. The wealth of generic options that hit more cards and for less mana have rendered Mudhole nothing more than an oddity, with no real hope of seeing any actual use in the game. And at number 9, we have Scornful Egotist. This human wizard costs 7 generic mana and 1 blue mana, and has 1 power and toughness. Generally speaking, the more mana you spend on a creature, the more power and toughness you want it to have. Of course, creatures with powerful abilities might have their stats rein in as a balancing measure, but with a single point of toughness, Scornful Egotist dies to just about anything. And with only 1 power, it will rarely ever get to trade in combat. Scornful Egotist does have the ability Morph, which allows you to cast it face down as a 2 power and toughness creature for 3 mana, and then turn it face up at any time for its morph cost. While Egotist's morph cost of a single blue mana is quite low, you'd be paying mana to make Scornful Egotist lose power and toughness. Since Morph is the only ability this card has, it is genuinely stronger when it's face down. This is already bad, but made even worse when compared to basically any other card with Morph. Morph creatures often allow you to surprise your opponent with their effects, or at the very least, offer potential payoff or high stats if you eventually pay their Morph costs. Scornful Egotist offers no benefits since there's no reason to ever want to turn it face up, and its face down cost is identical to every other Morph card. If your deck needs Morph, it has countless other options that provide some benefits. The only upside to Scornful Egotist is that if you play it face down, your opponent might assume you're playing an actual good Morph card, and they might spend resources trying to remove it. But Scornful Egotist isn't even all that appealing of a bait, and that alone is no reason to run a card with such terrible stats. While you'll never actually cast it for 8 mana, the fact that it is an 8 mana 1/1 ensures that it will never have a practical use without a strong ability. As such, Scornful Egotist is only remotely close to playable when it's face down and not itself. And a card so bad you need to keep it face down is certainly useless enough for this list, even if there are more cards that are somehow more worthless than this one. And at number 8, we have 9 Ringed Bow. This artifact costs 3 generic mana and can be tapped to deal 1 damage to target spirit creature. If the creature would die this turn, exile it instead. Now, dealing 1 damage itself isn't inherently worthless. Although it's as low an amount as one can deal, there are high mana value creatures that only have a single toughness. Goblin Sharpshooter historically saw play in part because of how effective it was at taking out mana producing creatures or other low stat but high value targets. However, there's a wide variety of creature types that have these sorts of creatures to a point where there's not much value in specifically targeting a single one. Spirits in particular are a poor choice, given that their play pattern is built around not just protection, but also specifically increasing their own stats. Spirits are only susceptible to 9 Ringo Bow in their earliest turns of setup, which is usually too late to cast a 3 mana artifact anyways. There are better options to deal with spirits, such as hard removal or an outright board wipe that works no matter how many power and toughness boosting effects the spirit player might have. And even if the card did allow you to target non-spirits, its only real use would be more for exile effect other than the damage it dealt. If a creature was going to die, you could tap 9-ring bow to deal 1 damage and also ensure that whenever the creature dies, it was exiled. While this is a novel interaction, it's one that's entirely unnecessary given the number of cards that exile creatures upon death in the first place. And beyond all of this, it's important to note that any of this requires your opponent to be playing spirits in the first place. If your opponent doesn't have any spirits in their deck, then the card does literally nothing. You can't even tap it since there's no spirits on the board in the first place. And while there is a spirit deck in Pioneer that sees some decent play, the card would both be too narrow and too ineffective for consideration if it was legal in the format. Every other format, it's far less likely you'll ever play against a spirit-focused deck, and as such, 9-ringed bow offers essentially no real reason to run it in any deck at all. Maybe if the card worked against elves, you'd be more likely to see it in some sideboard play over the years, but it's so slow even with that in mind that no specific creature type could have likely made it good. And at number 7, we have the Great Wall. This enchantment costs 2 generic and 1 white mana and allows you to block creatures with Planeswalk as if they did not have Planeswalk. While to a new player this might sound like it involves a Planeswalker card type, it actually refers to the basic land type Planes. This ability means if you control a Planes, a creature with Planeswalk is unblockable. Of course, this means if you don't have a Planes, then you can block the creature perfectly normal as if it didn't have an ability at all. This is inherently a deal breaker for the mechanic since merfolk decks in some formats actively make use of Island Walk. However, this is because not only does Lord of Atlantis give all your merfolks Island Walk, but also thanks to the fact that there are multiple ways to give your opponent an island that directly works with the deck. White does have a creature that has a similar effect since Graceful Antelope can make a land become plains until it leaves the battlefield, but Graceful Antelope costs 4 mana, and even though it has Planeswalk itself, it only has 1 power. And this is only one of 4 sanctioned format cards that naturally have the ability to Planeswalk. The only creature that allows a creature to gain Planeswalk is Aeson Highway, which costs 6 mana and gives all white creatures Planeswalk. As such, Planeswalk is one of the most narrow keyword abilities around, with only 8 cards ever printed that mention the ability by name. In comparison, Forest Walk has about 50 cards and has even seen creatures with the keyword printed as recently as Modern Horizons 2. And thus brings us back to Great Wall, a card that specifically exists to counter an ability that shows up on 4 creatures, none of which have a power higher than 3. Even if there was a high density of playable Planeswalk creatures, the card would be far too narrow to see any play. There are various unblockable creatures that have seen some level of play, and the general answer to those creatures is just remove them. Especially in white, where you have access to some of the best 1 mana value removal spells in the game. There's really no need to jump through hoops to block creatures, especially not ones that deal such limited damage. And at number 6, we have Common Cause. This enchantment costs 2 generic and 1 white mana and gives all non-artifact creatures +2 power and toughness as long as they all share a color. Glorious Anthem style effects have found success in the past in aggressive white decks. These decks often tend to be mono-white, so at surface level, it might seem like this card is potentially a powerful inclusion. The creatures themselves can even be multicolor as long as they all share 1 color. But as noted in a somewhat passive-aggressive Gathering ruling from 2004, Common Cause really does mean all creatures, including your opponents. This means even if all of your creatures are white, as long as your opponent controls even 1 creature that isn't white, no creatures get the bonus. This requires you to play against someone who is playing the same color as you and that all other non-artifact creatures share that color. It's already enough to ask for you to build your deck to only play creatures of the same color, but considering your opponent has to match, it's very rare you'll get to turn the effect on in the first place. And even if you do, since it counts all creatures, your opponent's creatures will get the +2 power and toughness as well. Common Cause will never give you any actual advantage, since it will either not work or will give every creature, including the enemy ones, the boost. And when considered for a format like Commander with multiple opponents, it's rare you'll ever see this card's ineffective boost go off at all in a game. There are various Anthem effects that offer similar boosts that are much easier to meet the requirements of, such as Tempered Steel, giving every artifact creature you control +2 power and toughness with no downsides or ways to potentially lose the effect. Common Cause's ability would have been borderline playable if it only counted your creatures. But since it always takes your opponents into account, it falls right into being functionally useless. But at least the card is not an active detriment to you, which could not be said for every card ahead of it on this list. And at number 5, we have Wood Elemental. This creature costs 3 generic and 1 green mana and is an elemental whose power and toughness are equal to the number of untapped force you sacrifice as it enters the battlefield. When a spell requires you to sacrifice a land, it tends to have a beneficial effect or usually outright increases your mana overall. Wood Elemental offers very little in exchange for your lands, and even goes so far as to require the lands to be untapped. A card like Harrow can sacrifice a tap land to get even more value out of your mana that turn, whereas Wood Elemental needs you to both have 4 green mana, and then enough untapped lands to give Wood Elemental decent stats. And the more stats you give the card, the more it sets you back on mana. Even if you get Wood Elemental be a lethal attacker, it lacks any other abilities of any kind. meaning it has no way of getting through and around blockers and is completely wide open to target removal. Wood Elemental is one of the worst creatures ever printed in terms of just how steep its cost and how minimal the payoff it offers in return is. Molimo, Morrow Sorcerer, a card printed all the way back in Invasion, not only had power equal to the lands you control, but thanks to the trample keyword could push through damage even if a small creature blocked it. While Molimo costs 3 more mana than Wood Elemental, it will almost certainly be bigger than Wood Elemental and not set you back on your mana for the next several turns. And in the years since, we've only seen even more powerful riffs on this effect, which only serve to make Wood Elemental feel more useless. While it can technically be a decent beat stick, the cost to make it one makes it far too risky to play. And at number 4, we have Power Surge. This enchantment costs 2 red mana and deals damage to each player on their upkeep equal to the number of untapped lands they controlled at the beginning of their turn. This card, as it works in the modern game, has very little practical use since you can simply tap all your lands on the end phase of your opponent's turn. While this will leave a narrow window where you're tapped out, your opponent is very limited in terms of what they can do in their end phase. Then you won't have to worry about any damage from Power Surge at all, as it only cares about lands that were tapped at the beginning of the turn. When the card was first printed, there was still a concept known as mana burn in the game. If you had unspent mana at the end of the phase, whenever you lost that mana, each mana would deal 1 point of damage to you. As such, the obvious move of tapping all your lands at the end of your opponent's turn did not work at the time of the card's printing. If a player did try tapping all of their mana to get around Power Surge, the mana burn would just deal the same amount of damage. Instead, a player was now forced to consider taking damage if they hold up their mana for interaction and wind up not using it at all. It also would punish players for running out of steam since they had no cards to play, and thus no ways to spend mana. The Power Surge would deal a sizable chunk of damage. Of course, now that there's no mana burn, all of this is avoided by just tapping those unused lands and moving on. This card had a use at one point, but now has been rendered useless by the modernization of the game. Magic the Gathering actively avoids power level based erratas, and thus has opted to leave some cards that worked around old rules in their original, borderline unfunctional state. And while Power Surge might still have some very narrow potential uses, the cards ahead of it are all the more pointless in the game. And at number 3, we have Apocalypse Chime. This artifact costs 2 generic mana and has an ability that allows you to pay 2 generic mana, tap, and sacrifice Chime. And if you do, it destroys all non-token permanents with a name originally printed in the Homelands expansion. Magic the Gathering generally does not print effects like this anymore, given that it's hard to track which cards originally came from what set with so many sets in the game. However, this alone does not make the card worthless. In fact, anti-set cards do see some niche sideboard playing Vintage with City in a Bottle, able to prevent notoriously powerful cards from that set, such as Bazaar Baghdad, from even being played. What makes this card a niche sideboard option is that it specifically counters strong cards that just so happen to originate from a certain set. Apocalypse Chime specifically targets cards from Homelands, and to those unaware, Homelands is notorious for being one of the worst sets in all of Magic the Gathering. The only cards from Homelands that sees any level of play is Merchant Scroll, which is a strong search effect but not a card type that Apocalypse Chimes even interacts with. The most notable permanent you might be able to remove with Apocalypse Chime is a copy of Joven's Ferrets, which is to say that you really won't find much use for it at all. If Apocalypse Chime hit cards from another set, the card could potentially have been extremely powerful. Considering Apocalypse Chime works on lands as well, if it had not been for a set like Ravnica, City of Guilds, then the card would have been some of the most powerful land destruction in the game, since it would be able to hit shock lands as well as various other notable cards from Magic's history. This is of course purely hypothetical since the type of card is no longer printed and Apocalypse Chime will only ever care about Homelands cards. There will never be any newer cards that suddenly make Apocalypse Chime stronger. Instead, new cards will simply push the already terrible Homelands cards even further into obscurity. However, the card does at least do something. And in a world where Homelands was a better set, the card might genuinely see some sideboard play. This is why it's only third on the list, since the next 2 cards from a design standpoint are even more flawed. And at number 2, we have Break Open. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 red mana and turns target face-down creature an opponent controls face up. As previously mentioned with Scornful Egotist, there are ways for creatures to be face down, most commonly in the form of morph creatures. However, the whole gimmick of morph creatures is that you usually want to eventually flip them up if you're playing them. A face-down creature is just a 2 power 2 toughness body without even a creature type. The only time you'd prefer a face-down creature to be face-up is when it's a copy of Scornful Egotist, and when a card is only effective counter to one of the other worthless cards on this list, it certainly earns its spot. If Break Open could flip your own creatures face-up, it can actually be somewhat useful, since many morph creatures have really high morph cost that Break Open could circumvent. It would also provide a counter to a card like Ixidron, which could flip your non-morph creatures face down and leave it stranded without any abilities. But since it can only target your opponents, essentially all Break Open can do is help your opponent. Break Open doesn't even get around abilities, since many abilities on cards designed to go face down trigger when a card is turned face up. Beyond all of this, even the best morph cards do not see much play in competitive formats. meaning even ignoring all of the ways Break Open is a bad card, it's a bad card that you'd almost never have a target for in the first place. Face down cards are much more of a gameplay element in Yu-Gi-Oh! And when in Magic a card is strictly a worse version of Book of Tai-Yu, there's really nothing redeeming it. And as such, Break Open is the most worthless design ever printed. However, there is one more card that started almost decent and became pretty much worthless as the rules of the game changed. And finally, at number 1, the most useless card is Master of Arms. This human soldier costs 2 generic and 1 white mana and has 2 power and toughness. The best thing going for this card is that it has the keyword ability First Strike, which means it will deal damage before other creatures in combat. This allows Master of Arms to kill a creature with 2 or less toughness without taking any damage itself. This aggressive keyword encourages you to attack with the creature, so perhaps it's no surprise its second ability actively aims to interact with blockers. For 1 generic and 1 white mana, you can tap a creature blocking Master of Arms. While the creature must be untapped to declare a block, once that block is declared, it doesn't actually matter if they're tapped or not. When Master of Arms was first printed, tapped blockers didn't do damage, a rule which has since been phased out of the game entirely. And since Wizards of the Coast actively avoids power level based erratas, Master of Arms did not receive a new ability to compensate for the rules change. Since Master of Arms still functions within the rules, they did not change the card, even though the ability no longer prevents damage. While there are certainly corner case scenarios where tapping a creature that's blocking Master of Arms might be beneficial, it's not an effect that Master of Arms is likely to survive. If it's a creature that dies to First Strike damage, then tapping it usually will not matter. And if you tap down a bigger creature, it will still deal damage and kill Master of Arms. Trading an attacking creature to tap the thing blocking it and not even kill it is not worth it at all, which is understandable considering that wasn't what the card was designed to do. While Master of Arms wouldn't be powerful if it still worked like it originally did, it certainly would at least have some sort of function. But as it works now, it simply has a vestigial ability that's a novelty more than a functioning game mechanic. As such, there's no other cards that are more directly or obviously useless than the one that Wizards actively chose to leave behind. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.